and we are now coming to an end after a very intense program that was started this morning by President Vartan Gregorian, whom we have to thank for bringing this day, making this day possible together with the team. Before I briefly want to conclude this day, let me also share a notion of hope from our end, the Carnegie Foundation Peace Palace in The Hague, after these discussions on non-proliferation. I think it's a message of hope that in an era of tensions rising, a conflict like Kashmir between Pakistan and India, the President of Pakistan has decided, even after having lost another case to India recently at the Peace Palace in the International Court of Justice, to bring the case of Kashmir in front of the International Court of Justice to seek for justice. Both countries do have nuclear power, but they decide to go for the rule of law. There is always hope, I think. This day, this discussion marks the end of the second Carnegie Peacebuilding Conversations that we had. And I'd like to briefly look back at where it all started. Not just this morning, with the opening words, but, of course, 100 years ago, when Andrew Carnegie left us with the institutions and the endowments for our missions. 22 institutions still active today. And Vartan Gregorian not only made this day possible, but at the beginning of this century, when already the first century after the legacy of Andrew Carnegie was well on its way, he brought together the Carnegie institutions that are now a Carnegie family of institutions for the first awarding of the Carnegie Medal of Philanthropy. And tomorrow we will have another award ceremonies where philanthropy is really celebrated. It was during that occasion, when each time I have the privilege to attend, that we were impressed by what all the Carnegie institutions all do, promoting the legacy of Andrew Carnegie. We felt that it was necessary to add to the events where we all come together, also more on the peace legacy of Andrew Carnegie, and I think that's what we just did today. We had the first Carnegie Peacebuilding Conversations last year in The Hague at the Peace Palace. In your goodie bags, you will find the publication that is a result of the discussions we then had, and we have had very rich discussions today. So I'd like to briefly make the bridge between The Hague and New York. When I do so in concluding this day, of course, it's impossible to summarize all that's been said today by our distinguished speakers. So I can only be brief and mention some highlights and be very grateful. I think it was Secretary Rodham Clinton who mentioned the gutsy women and the belief in fundamental human rights and how they are so important. The rule of law protects the vulnerable, and the notion of the rule of law and the inspiration of these women is so crucial still today. She also mentioned, when going over the geopolitics with Ambassador Burns, the case of the South China Sea. And also there, the legacy of Andrew Carnegie is relevant, because one of the first cases that had to be facilitated at the Peace Palace when I took office 4 years ago was between China and the Philippines on the South China Sea. So working on peace through law, as was envisioned and was supported by Andrew Carnegie, that's what we do, trying to deal with the major issues of our time. It was great to hear the notion to invest in diplomacy and build alliances with partnerships. I think it was also the Dutch consul who was happy to hear the call for investment in diplomacy. We also heard the notion that how important it is to regain trust and to promote trust, overcome divides through listening, through dialogue, and that is exactly what we envisage today. Ambassador Burns mentioned that we live in transformative times. Yesterday we had a presentation on the 7 revolutions we face. I'll not get into that right now anymore, but it's very important that we bring politics, these revolutions, together to seek the peaceful option and advance peace. What was mentioned also was how people doze off when discussions about changing of institutions take place. I think it is important to share that, of course, the United Nations, who were represented here today by both the Undersecretary Secretary General and an Assistant Secretary General, have only been established after the League of Nations was dissolved, because it was not up to the challenges of that time. So the call for diplomacy and international cooperation is crucial, and I think the Sustainable Development Goals that were mentioned are probably the most ambitious peace program that we have, and we are happy in The Hague to serve as a house that, of course, has embraced Sustainable Development Goal 16 on peace, justice, and stronger institutions. Those are the institutions we house. We want to continue that dialogue because the institutional development is crucial to promoting peace. People in the streets do not only doze off when they hear about institutional discussions, but also, of course, they're disappointed by the lack of decision-making in the Security Council, for instance, because of vetoes. Well, the General Assembly does not have vetoes, and also judges in the International Court of Justice don't have vetoes. There has to be an award when parties seek justice. So promoting the institutional developments is crucial to advance the challenges of our time. It was David Miliband and Michel Nuns who said that freedom is at stake and that leadership is needed. And if governments retreat, civic engagement and private sector actors are so important to address the challenges with new tools. And that, of course, brings us then back to the question why we wanted to do this as Carnegie institutions. Do we live up to the expectations of Andrew Carnegie a century after he passed away? We hope to. We sure hope to. We heard the call today still on the need for education, the need for dialogue. Well, that is exactly, of course, what is part of the legacy of Andrew Carnegie, with the institutions working to promote education and dialogue. I think when he would hear the call today, not just from the representatives that were yesterday presenting their impressive presentation about the work we do within the family of institutions, but also the call today on education and dialogue, you'd be happy that we fill that out with ambitious programs. And when we think of international cooperation and the challenges, also peace education is so important. Just last year, I had the pleasure of attending the conference of the American Society of International Law here in the United States in Washington. The theme of that closing seminar was multilateralism is dead. And in fact, the notion that came from that panel was, no, international law is richer than it ever was. We now have so many international conventions, but there are two challenges we face. National implementation, states implementing international law, that is an issue. And people in the streets are not aware of what all there is in terms of international law, what states and non-state actors have to abide by. So education, peace education is crucial, because ideally we would, of course, want our peoples to know that there are other options than going to war, that people call on their leaders to seek the peaceful options. Well, this day, I've never had such a heavy lunch, not because we Europeans are not accustomed to the size of the plates here in the United States, but because the lunch was so heavy on substance. I think the way we were taken from the history in 1919 to now also gave important notion. That what was shared there was also about peace through law. And when we just had this panel on swords or plowshares, I would like to share another story of hope with you from the Peace Palace. Because Andrew Carnegie wanted to support that, because he felt that in his broad legacy, promoting heroism, promoting education, promoting science, promoting peace was also of the essence. And he really believed in this permanent court of arbitration. So in the early days, there was this gift from countries that support the ideal of peace through law. And that was a gift from Argentina. It was on a case that is very comparable to issues of our time. Namely, Argentina wanted access to the ocean through Chile. We now know the situation of Russia that wants access through the Crimea area. So this is an issue of all times. What happened is the cannons were already moving towards the front, and imagine all the loss of human lives that would be the consequence, but then they realized we had just been part of this treaty to solve our solutions peacefully through arbitrations. In their wisdom, the arbitrators found a solution that both countries agreed to. So literally, the biblical notion in this Catholic part of our hemisphere of melting your swords into plowshares was practiced because the cannons were turned into this huge statue of Jesus Christ preaching peace. And the copy of that is in the Peace Palace. The real deal is still on the border of Argentina and Chile and the Andes Mountains. There's much more to be said about the correlation of technology and peace than the richness that was just shared. The notion of climate. It was great also yesterday to hear how the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs, that really puts ethics at the forefront, also embraced as one of its central themes climate. And we know that the dialogue on climate will be continued, and we'd be happy to be part of it. The same goes for the dialogues on artificial intelligence, cybersecurity. Many dialogues take part at the Peace Palace, and we're happy that the panelists have shown that we're not alone in addressing the concerns that we all have. As Senator Nunn just said, we need sustained dialogues, and that is exactly what we're in for as a result of the legacy of Andrew Carnegie. We gladly invite stakeholders to continue the dialogue, to work on a peace agenda. It was said today how much we need the societal engagement of civic actors, NGOs, youth. I'm happy that there are so many students here around today, philanthropies and philanthropists, and academia. And that is exactly what we also aim to do through these conversations that we here have today, and continued conversations. We cannot wait for the next generation to solve today's conflicts. We need to take action now. As the Senator just said, time is of the essence. Now, before closing with these notions of hope and dialogue, that we can address the issues together based on our joint activities, I'm of course very grateful. Grateful that thanks to the Carnegie Corporation of New York, President Gregorian and his staff, we could have these conversations today. And Jeannie D'Onofrio and the team are, of course, very much thanked for their efforts. I really call you all to give them a warm applause for what they all did. We are also grateful for the bridge that was built across the Atlantic from Scotland by Angus Hague, who liaised with us in The Hague and with New York to develop this program. Thank you so much, Angus. It's great that we don't... Yes, yes. In concluding, I'd like to quote Andrew Carnegie, not on peace, but on how to work together. Teamwork is the ability to work together to a common vision. It is the fuel that allows common people to attain uncommon results. And that is what we need to do. We want to continue to join our efforts in developing the League of Peace that Andrew Carnegie called for in his rectorial address at St. Andrews. And let me then finish with another person of inspiration. The Nuremberg trials were mentioned, and we had the privilege this year of having Benjamin Ferencz at the Peace Palace. He is a survivor of the Holocaust. He was the first, and he's the last surviving prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials, and he's now nearly 100 years old. He's nearly 100 years old, and he's present at the Peace Palace with a bench, and the bench says his motto. His motto is law, not war. And when he addressed the crowd, he said, if you have any questions about how to address the challenges we face, I have 3 lessons. 1, never give up. 2, never give up. And 3, never give up indeed. I hope we will do that. We will work towards peace together. Thank you so much for having joined us. We look forward to continuing the conversations here in The Hague and elsewhere.